Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. That is Vince Adera, our football analyst, and we are today going to talk about Brian Kelly and Notre Dame. And the thing that has been sort of the discussion for years, Vince, there's been sort of this within Notre Dame fandom, within the Notre Dame media, there's been sort of this constant sort of tug of war of, is Brian Kelly an elite coach that took Notre Dame as far as it can go? Or is Brian, and we're going to have that conversation as a follow-up to this one. Or is Brian Kelly a really good coach that took Notre Dame a long way from where it was, but is not someone that was capable of taking it to the next step that it's capable to go to? And that's sort of the conversation we're going to have here today, is that. And I think this is an important conversation to have, because it's going to play into what Jack Swarbrick needs to do when he makes this next hire. Because my big concern, Vince, is that Jack Swarbrick is going to go hire another Brian Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm kind of giving away my opinion on this subject, but we're going to go through one by one and really talk through what these different aspects are. So to begin, Brian Kelly did a lot of great things in Notre Dame, right? Can we just get that out? Like,
yeah, I think
should be able to admit that.
That's a stipulation, right? If we're in court, like, everybody in the room can stipulate that Brian Kelly did a good job at Notre Dame, bringing them back to relevance, right? Bringing them back to a contender that wins games they're supposed to win. And, they're not going to lose to the Tulsas and to the Dukes and to the, what is it, 41 straight games over ranked opponents or what?
In the last 5 years, Notre Dame has gone 54-9.
There you go.
They are 41-0 against teams that were unranked.
Right.
And they are 13-9 against teams that were ranked. Now, that number actually drops a little bit when you look at teams that finished ranked, but we're just going to go for now against teams that were ranked when they played.
Right.
13-9.
Right.
So continue your point.
Yeah. So I will stipulate that he brought Notre Dame back to a place of relevance. And Jack Swarbrick was absolutely correct in his press conference yesterday when he said that the program is in much better shape than 12 years ago when he was conducting a coaching search in the first place. He's 100% correct. This is a very, very stable program, and he commended the staff. He said it's such a solid staff. I don't need to name an interim coach. All these different things that he said are absolutely correct, right? Overall, the staff is a very, very good staff. And he has faith that the staff is going to continue doing what they do, and that's fantastic. And then, so in other words, to me, that means you want to keep continuity, but that's another conversation. So this is a good job, or however you want to phrase it. Notre Dame's program is back to where it should be, but it still can get better. But it is a much better job than it was 12 years ago. It's a much better. The program is in tremendous shape in comparison to where
different
it was.
Planets than where it was in 2009 when he took over.
No question.
I mean, in every way, shape, form, or fashion. And one of the things that I look at when you look at Brian Kelly, and I don't really care much about the Coach of the Year awards because they're a byproduct of a great season, and they had some really, really great regular seasons at Notre Dame relative to the expectations nationally, the perceived expectations about Notre Dame. And so when I look at the things he's accomplished, Vince, you talk about let's talk about the first 6 years. 8-5, 8-5, 12-1, 9-4, 8-5, and then you had the 10-2 or 10-3. So you had even then, in some of the up and down of the early starts, you still had where 8-5, was the down year, and you look at the previous 10 years, 8-5 was sort of like the up and down. And, when I look at it, it's like that was a positive. That was a small step in the right direction. Then 2016 happens.
You're right.
And then, Brian Kelly's forced to make some changes, and he did. And the program just took off and just maintained a level of consistency that we hadn't seen at Notre Dame really since the middle of Lou Holtz's tenure. Not even the end of Lou Holtz's tenure. I mean, they were 6-5-1, 9-3, and 8-3 in his last 3 years, right? We saw a level of success that we hadn't seen since, 88 to 93, really, in regards to just the sustained success. But a part of that, if we're going to be honest, is Jack Swarbrick also helped Brian Kelly out by giving them more manageable schedules. Some of it is necessary. Some of it has been due to, like Jack Swarbrick did not try to put a schedule together that was going to end the season with no ranked opponents.
Right.
Exactly. Like you don't schedule Wisconsin and USC and Stanford, right? As you're in Cincinnati, if you want, no ranked wins, I should say. There is a ranked opponent, Cincinnati, and they beat you by 11 at your place.
Yeah, no doubt.
No ranked wins, right? So one ranked opponent, okay? And so when you look at that, it's like we have to admit they've benefited from Stanford and USC taking a dive the last 5 years. And Brian Kelly took full advantage of that. Kudos. He deserves props for that. This is not like it's not meant to be a backhanded compliment on Brian Kelly, because if he was still where he was from 10 to 15, Notre Dame would have lost a couple of those games to USC that they won. And they might have lost a couple of the games at Stanford, because those teams aren't any different than South Florida or Tulsa or Pitt or Navy or Northwestern or Louisville or other teams that they lost to during that stretch. And so he needs to be commended for that. And that level of consistency is a big part of why this is such a better job. It's not just the facilities. It's not just the money they've spent and the indoor facility, and that's all part of it. But it's also a level of consistency. People realize you can go to Notre Dame and be a 10-win team every year if you do things, the right way to a degree. So I think that consistency was also part of it, Vince. And that is something that concerns me. Just really veer off topic. I'm concerned that Jack Swarbrick is going to focus more on someone that can bring consistency more than someone who can really take this program.
Take them to the next level. Yeah, that's the key. No question. That's the key to me, is the search should be who can take Notre Dame and bump them to the next level, not maintain what they have right now. And if you're looking for that coach, there's going to be some risk involved, right? I mean, you can go with a safe pick. In my personal opinion, I think Luke Fickell is a safe pick. I think, I guess Campbell would even be a gamble, but he's more along the lines of a safe pick to me.
Yeah, because he would always have better talent than the teams he plays.
Correct. There you go. And so he would fall into the safe pick for me. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see. It's almost like, well, we're not talking about the search right now, right? So I got to veer it back to this,
because that's what we're trying to talk about. Is we're trying to talk about Notre Dame's program and its potential, and what is its emphasis.
Yes, and if you want to continue 10 wins a year, that's fine. I mean, if that's what you want, then that's who you'll be.
Right.
But if you want to compete for championships, which is what they claim that they want to do, then I think the decision is very clear. But it is what it is. So Brian Kelly brought them to a consistent level that we see today. No question about it. They were not even in the stratosphere of that when he took over.
Right. I would argue they actually had more big wins his first 5 years than they did the last 5. It's just those big. I mean, you beat a top 10 Stanford team in 2012. You beat a top 15 Oklahoma team on the road in 2012. You had a big win over Michigan State in 2013. That was a Michigan State team that finished in the top 13 or top 5. Excuse me. They went 13-1 that season. You go into I think it was 2013. They beat like 4 division champs. It was like Arizona State, Michigan State.
I remember that.
It was something like that. I think USC was the division champ. I gotta have to go back and look at the schedule that year, but it was like they beat several division champs that season. And so there were actually more of the the big wins, Vince, that during his early stretch than there was recently, in my opinion. The difference, however, is those big wins were countered by the bad losses. And, you talk about, going 8-5 in 2010, his first year, you should have beat Tulsa, right? No excuse to lose to Navy. No. Michigan, you lose is not your fault. It wasn't his fault they lost to Michigan. It wasn't his fault he inherited a quarterback roster that had Dane Chris and a bunch of freshmen, right? That wasn't on him. That was on Charlie Weiss. He didn't build that to where when Dane goes down against Michigan, when Notre Dame was rolling against Michigan, Dane goes down. It's not Brian Kelly's fault. The next options are Nate Montana, true freshman Tommy Rees, true freshman Andrew Hendricks, and true freshman Luke Massa. That wasn't on BK. What's that?
I mean, the depth. Well, I guess
that was his first year.
Yeah, I was gonna say back then it's not his fault. Yeah,
that wasn't his fault. That's what he inherited.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So when Dane Chris goes down and he's got to turn to Nate Montana and then Tommy Rees and then Michigan comes back, Dane comes back in and you go down and score again. And so I've always, you win that game if Dane Chris doesn't get hurt. That's not on Brian Kelly. Some of the decisions he made against Tulsa, those things are kind of on him, but that was sort of the inconsistency we saw. You have a 2014 season in which Notre Dame goes out and takes USC down to the wire and has some good wins there, and then, blow a lead in overtime and, blow a lead because of a poor 2-point conversion decision against Northwestern that cost you the game. You lose to Reggie Bonifant at quarterback. You have that falling apart thing. Like we all remember the USC game in 2014 when they were just injured. That's not why they lost to Louisville and Northwestern.
Right, exactly.
They lost to Louisville and Northwestern because of coaching decisions. And so those things have been gone. We have not seen those mistakes from Brian Kelly. And that's a lot of where that consistency comes from, because we're not seeing those bad losses. Pitt in 2013, and so those are the things, Vince, that I look at and I say that those are areas where Brian Kelly has done a really, really nice job of restoring Notre Dame to a level of respect and consistency that was needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is partly what makes it such an attractive program to me.
No question. I completely agree with that. I think that's exactly what he did. And, I don't know what the charge was when he got here, but he brought Notre Dame back to respectability, and he did a very good job of that. And I can nitpick a lot of things for sure, but overall he did what he needed to do, but there's still more left on the table. And I think that's the end of the conversation, right? I mean, we give him all the credit in the world for doing what he has done at Notre Dame. There is no question about it. And anybody that says else, otherwise, it's just not realistic. I mean, if anybody comes up to me and says, "Hey, Notre Dame's in the exact same place they were last time they were looking for a head coach," that's just false narrative, right? That's just, you are a hater, and that it is what it is, right? So this program's in a ton better shape, ton better shape. And I can tell you this: if the situation was what it was in 09, it was 09, right, when he was brought in, and the program is what it was then as it is now, or I would say, look, I don't really want anybody from the staff to hang around, right? I want to, hey, man, let's clean house. Let's start over, that kind of thing. I think because of where the program is right now, that's why I'm preaching consistency, with the program and some of the coaches that are here, and things of that nature. So I think that's telling, too, about where this program is. Does that make sense? I feel like I was rambling.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
So then let's talk about what are the things that held Brian Kelly back from taking that next step. Again, we can appreciate the good job he did, the consistency that he brought relative to what his successors did, and really relative to a lot of college football. I mean, if we're being honest, there aren't a lot of programs that can claim the success that Notre Dame has had the last 5 years, right? So there needs to be some a look at what was it that held him back, right? What was it that held him back? I think so. What we're gonna do next is we're gonna kind of go through some points. We're gonna go through what we think are like the 4 or 5 things that we think kept Brian Kelly from taking that next step, and then we're gonna discuss whether they were Notre Dame related, Brian Kelly related, or a little bit of both. And I think the first one, especially to me, is a little bit of both. And this, to me, is going to be a big part of the next hire, in my opinion, and that is recruiting. Now, there's really two stances that are often taken in the recruiting conversation, and I think both of them are correct and incorrect at the same time. The one notion is you can't recruit elite players in Notre Dame because of academics.
False.
Which I think is false.
False.
You can recruit anybody that you want because you're Notre Dame. False.
That's false.
The reality is there are kids that you can't recruit if you're Notre Dame, no matter whether that kid likes you or not, because A, doesn't have the academic requirements to get in, which are more stringent than a lot of schools, but not like Stanford and Northwestern. Okay. Mm-hmm. Common misconception. There are going to be kids who don't have any interest in going to class. I think Brian Kelly recruited a few too many of those his first 5 or 6 years, if we're being honest. Vince, you and I have both heard the stories about, what GAs had to do back in, 13 and 14 and 15 with some of the players is they had to kind of go to their classes every day and make sure they were there.
Ridiculous.
Right. And you're always going to have a little bit of that, but there was too much of that early in his tenure. And I think that's something where Brian Kelly adapted and he went too much in the opposite direction.
Right. Exactly.
Of that. And so those are the type of kids that you're just not going to be able to recruit. There's going to be some geographic reasons that you can't get certain kids. Some kids just don't want to go far away from home. I mean, that's understandable. Some kids, especially from smaller towns, the idea of going 6 states away is going to be a little daunting. Some parents don't want their kids to go far away from home. Now, Notre Dame's able to overcome that sometimes, but other times they're not able to overcome that. And so I think that the recruiting aspect of this is an interesting aspect to this as well, Vince, because you have to come to the understanding of who the next coach is that recruiting is going to be more challenging at Notre Dame, but it's not the excuse that people make it out to be. It's not the situation where, you just have to recruit the way Clark Lee did, or you have to recruit the way Brian Kelly did. So the recruiting aspect to me comes down into two different discussions. Number one is your strategy, and number two is the actual recruiting effort being put on the head coach. I want to address the second one first. That's 100% on Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly's unwillingness to really focus on his role in recruiting and being a more active recruiter has nothing to do with Notre Dame. Nothing. And so that is something that 100% nobody should be arguing at that, Vince. Nobody. That was a choice that Brian Kelly made when it comes to just he didn't make it a priority for the vast majority of his tenure at Notre Dame. For him.
Yes. And that's the accurate part. And the empirical evidence for me is, and I mean, yeah, I'm bringing up Marcus Freeman's name, but there's a reason, okay? Marcus Freeman went into backyards of big universities who are usually very good at recruiting. Let's just take Ohio State for an example, okay? And he said, look, why are we not recruiting these kids, right? I'm going to identify the best players in the country. I'm going to recruit them, and then we'll see how it works with Notre Dame. And that's exactly the attitude that you have to have in recruiting. That was not the attitude of the head coach. And because of that attitude, he got the head coach on board, and he was now starting to recruit and do some things and doing a lot better on the recruiting trail. They boxed themselves out of the recruiting conversation with a lot of the top players in the country. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, look, I'm not naive. There are players that you can't recruit at Notre Dame. Okay. There's no question about that. And those aren't the players that I'm even referring to. Okay. Apparently, according to everybody that we've been talking to, those are the players that go to LSU because that's who he's allowed to have now, because that's the big thing everybody's talking about is now Kelly can recruit anybody he wants. Okay. Mm-hmm. But look, if you're a Notre Dame fan, you don't want those kids anyway. Because you're a Notre Dame fan for a reason.
Every school has its restrictions. There's going to be kids that don't want to go to LSU because they visit Baton Rouge and they're like, this place is a little too different for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'll be honest, I couldn't fit in Baton Rouge. I've been down to that part of the country once. I have family from down that direction. I wouldn't fit in. Doesn't make them worse than me. Just makes them different. I'm just not comfortable there. I wouldn't like living in New York City because I don't like big cities. I'm not comfortable there. It's not that it's bad or worse. It's just I'm not comfortable there.
It's not for me. Yeah.
So every place has certain limitations, right? A kid who is very academic, a Kyle Hamilton, you're going to have a harder time recruiting to LSU. I mean, look, that's a 5-star kid that you're going to have a hard time recruiting to LSU because He's a kid that went to a really, really good private school who comes from a family that really values education. Okay.
Right.
So that's a situation where that's a 5-star kid that you're going to have a hard time getting at LSU. Now there's others are going to be able to get. The point is you're not going to have great recruiting classes if you don't put in the work. There's not a single successful program in America right now at the Division I level that is successful in spite of their head coach on the recruiting trail. Not one. Saban works, Day works, Urban worked, Dabo works, Kirby works doggedly. And that's just the reality. That was not a Notre Dame problem. That was a Brian Kelly problem. And now the other part is the strategy aspect of it. Now that is something that I think is partly why you need a dynamic coach, because Notre Dame does tend to change the rules from time to time, depending on the administration. Now, Brian Kelly benefited from a consistent administration his entire tenure.
Absolutely.
That hasn't always been the case. Same president, I believe, right? Jenkins was here when Kelly was hired, correct?
Yep.
Same athletic director.
Yep.
Like the stability at Notre Dame was very beneficial for Brian Kelly. Future coaches and past coaches haven't had that same benefit of Charlie Weiss worked for 2 ADs, right? Kevin White and obviously Jack Swarbrick at the end. So right now there is a level of stability that has benefited, but Notre Dame is an institution over the years has gone through changes. Look, we're going to be a little less academically oriented. We're going to be less work with the football program. We're going to be more willing to work with the football program. That's the reality. There were 10 times, especially like this is something that I think hurt Lou Holtz at the end and hurt Bob Davie. That was a period where Notre Dame just decided they wanted to not be as focused on football. There were times, during the 70s and late 70s and early 80s where Notre Dame wasn't necessarily as focused on football. And there were loud voices at Notre Dame that didn't want Lou Holtz as the head coach, right? There were loud voices in Notre Dame that didn't like Lou Holtz's entire tenure at Notre Dame,
right? Because
that's
true.
He brought emphasis back to football. So that is a challenge for Notre Dame, and that requires a unique person at head coach, and that is a unique challenge that you're not going to find, because if anybody at Alabama raises their voice about football not being important in Alabama, that person no longer has a job, right? Remember the comment that Gordon Gee made that got in trouble for when he was the president of Ohio State? I don't answer. Jim Tressel doesn't answer to me. I answer to Jim Tressel. Well, it's kind of like, dude, you're not supposed to say that out loud.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? Like,
it's understood. All
yeah,
right.
We all know that to be true, but you're not supposed to say that, right? That's never going to be the case in Notre Dame. Never will be the case in Notre Dame. The football coach will always have people he answers to. Right, Vince? And so that is something unique about Notre Dame, and it takes a unique person there. And that's one of those things I don't necessarily fault Brian Kelly for, because he is who he is. Now, what I do think, however, is that also you need to be able to adjust with geographic changes and challenges. And that's something that's changed in the last 20 years. When Lou Holtz was here, he could go into Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and New Jersey and Illinois, Chicago, and get big-time football players.
Yep.
Those guys still exist in those areas, but there's a lot less of them.
Yep.
Now, a lot of those families, because of law, a lot of it's about, employment migration, right? Which creates population shifts. And so now Atlanta's a much bigger hotbed for recruiting. North Carolina is got a lot more recruits in it. You're starting to see Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana producing more of those type of players. Texas has obviously always been kind of big. And Chicago's almost like it's an afterthought now in recruiting for Notre Dame.
Yeah.
30 years ago, that had been unheard of.
Right, exactly.
And you're also seeing not as many of the big Catholic schools in the Midwest are producing the same number of big-time players. St. Ignatius is not producing the same number of big-time players it used to. Moeller's not producing the number of big-time players it used to. I have been told that one of the things Jack Swarbrick is looking at, and it's one of the reasons he likes Luke Fickell, is Jack Swarbrick thinks that Notre Dame's got to get back in with the Midwestern Catholic schools. If that's true, that tells me he has a complete disconnect to what's going on in high school football right now.
And that would surprise me, though, wouldn't it?
Not really.
Oh, that would surprise me.
Not really.
Yeah.
He's getting towards the end of his tenure as well.
Agreed.
But look, those programs just don't produce the volume of players that they used to. And you can't make a living off of the Northern, Midwestern Catholic schools anymore. There's not enough of those kids anymore. And so bringing in a coach because that's your number one priority would be a mistake. That would be a Notre Dame problem. That wasn't what Brian Kelly was necessarily brought in for, I don't believe. At least if it was a mistake. But Brian Kelly didn't focus on that.
Well, I don't think when he was brought in, it was that narrow-mindedly focused. You know what I mean? Like it was, man, fix it. Like fix it. All right. And I think that's more along the lines of what it was when Brian Kelly came in. Now it's like, okay, we've got all this success. Let's drill down on what we can do and, things like that. It's like, okay, let's not overthink this. Mm-hmm. And I feel like what you just said feels way more like an overthinking process to me. You know what I mean? Like I really hope, and I saw that exact thing that you just said, and I don't like that at all. I think that does show a major disconnect with what is going on right now in college football.
Yeah, and it is the one thing that has me concerned about what decision Jack is going to make, and we'll get into this later in other shows. But that's why I say if this goes into the weekend and there's no resolution of Marcus Freeman being head coach, it tells me he's waiting for Luke Fickell, which would be a big mistake. But so when I look at recruiting, Vince, I think we can accept the fact that there are certain limitations to Notre Dame and still say it is more challenging at Notre Dame without saying Brian Kelly did not at all maximize the potential of Notre Dame as a recruiting operation. And I would say it would be a bad argument for us to make if we could only point to Marcus Freeman.
Sure.
My point about Marcus Freeman is the final culmination and the final nail in that coffin, because we've seen this in the past, right? We saw a year in 2011, the 2011 class, where Notre Dame went down to Florida, Georgia, New York City, and got 3 5-star defensive ends, right? Because they had won the year before. We've seen Notre Dame go down to Florida and get kids that it wanted. Tony Alford did that. He made a living getting kids like that, right? Mike Denbrock did a great job of bringing in really good recruits. He was a big-time recruiter. We saw that with Chip Long. Mike Elko were very strong recruiters in Notre Dame. Autry Denson comes in, and all of a sudden the storyline changes. Well, Notre Dame can't, big-time backs don't want to come to Notre Dame, right? That was the BS accepted, because this is what bothers me is like you get these these entities that cover Notre Dame, and I'm not talking about like Priester and guys like that. They're Tim's a professional. He'll call it like he sees it, even if he and I don't necessarily agree. I'm talking about there's so many of these fan sites, and there's a place that used to be really respected that now it's just become like a like we're just fanboys and we're just we're Brian Kelly hype men. Things like that, and you get too much of that to where it's like, well, Autry Denson's not doing a good job. So instead of challenging that, it's big time recruits don't want to come to play running back anymore at Notre Dame. Like as soon as Tony Alford left, bam, at that moment, big time running back stopped wanting to come to Notre Dame.
Amazing.
Then you bring in Lance Taylor, and all of a sudden Notre Dame's got a loaded backfield again.
Right.
So all of a sudden, big running backs decided, I do like Notre Dame again. It has nothing to do with the coaching job, right? And that was the thing, to me, the things that hurt Brian Kelly is Brian Kelly would have really good recruiters on staff. The issue that he had is he had far too many that weren't. And because he didn't work, he couldn't demand that his rest of his staff put in the work. That was one of the things that created a lot of tension with Chip Long and some of the assistants on the offensive staff.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
And it doesn't work.
Right. And so then when Chip Long would jump on these guys, they'd then go run into Kelly because, that's – I don't know why you're always on me about calling recruits and stuff, right? That's not what we do. This is Notre Dame. Yeah. I've been told that's one of the things Marcus Freeman didn't like – or, Mike Elko didn't like, was that there just wasn't enough – big-time recruiters on the staff, and guys weren't willing to do the work. And then Clark Lee, it worked great for Clark Lee because Clark Lee was a guy that likes finding those diamonds in the rough, and he was trying to recruit like this is Wake Forest. And a great coach, but just let's be honest, Clark Lee had a lot of success coaching guys that other people recruited, if we're going to be honest about it, right? And so now you look at it, and then Marcus Freeman comes in, and it's that final, you've got what Freeman's doing and what Elson is doing, and Taylor's a solid recruiter, and Tommy's a dogged recruiter, and there's now Mickens is a really good recruiter. There's now enough guys on staff, and Jeff Quinn's not an elite recruiter, but he's a good recruiter.
He's good. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I would say he's good.
And so you've got enough guys on the staff that are showing you that when your staff is good and your head coach finally gets involved, look at the results. And you've got a winning product to sell. So to me, recruiting at the end of the day, Vince, we can accept the fact that it's harder at Notre Dame, but I think the notion that you can't recruit at an elite level at Notre Dame is false, because Notre Dame can go out to De La Salle and get an Isaiah Foskey, who maybe needs a year of development. They can find the prospects that have the big upsides all over the country, and not many schools can do that outside of like Bama and Ohio State, and I mean that the list isn't very long. I don't know how much longer it is in that. Michigan to a degree. There's a lot of schools that can't go everywhere and get kids. Notre Dame can.
Yeah.
LSU's not going to go sign 8 kids from California next year. You know what I mean? Like it's a different animal. Oklahoma's probably another one that can go because they're kind of right in the middle of the country. They can go to Texas. They can go to California. They have some success in the Southeast. So, Vince, that's to me is that there aren't a lot of schools that can do what Notre Dame can do. And so I don't think recruiting is something that holds it back. I think my final piece on this is we can, like I said, we can accept the fact that recruiting is different and harder at Notre Dame, which puts an even greater emphasis on the head coach making sure he is hiring a staff filled with mostly strong recruiters.
Yep.
And Brian Kelly did not do that enough during his tenure.
I completely agree with you. I think that if you are a dynamic recruiter, which Marcus Freeman is, he's going to look for people that have a similar mindset to him, right? I mean, doesn't that make sense? When you're looking to hire somebody, you want somebody that is going to have a similar mindset to you and buy in to the philosophy of your program. And clearly, recruiting is important to him. I mean, just in the conversations that we've heard publicly, with Chris Zorich, with us, with whoever, whenever you hear him talk, clearly recruiting is important to him. And so I would be absolutely shocked if he put somebody on wherever he ends up being head coach and he starts putting together a staff. I think recruiting is going to be one of the most important things to him on the resume for bringing guys in. I really, really do. And again, we'll see what that looks like moving forward if he gets a head coaching job someplace. But I think that since he is such a dynamic recruiter, then he's going to have dynamic recruiters on his staff. And if they're not dynamic and they're just good, he will turn them into dynamic recruiters.
Mm-hmm. Right. And again, that's another reason that a lot of people want to make a push for Marcus Freeman, because he's a dynamic recruiter. That one thing that Marcus Freeman has done since he got here is he raised the bar of everyone around him.
Exactly. And that's what good leadership is, right? I mean, is that not what you want in a leader? Somebody that's going to raise the level of everybody around him.
Like the funny part is there's this guy in the chat now that I just had to put on timeout who's raving against anti-Marcus Freeman. And he said, we don't need someone as inexperienced like Ty Willingham, which is just a ridiculous comment.
Ty Willingham was a head coach.
Pac-12 head coach. It's a ridiculous comment. I'm not going to get into why he's comparing him to Ty Willingham. But the thing about it is he's talking about like, well, how's Luke Fickell not dynamic when he has a record of whatever it is? Brian Kelly had an even better record at Cincinnati, and he was beating teams that are now in Power 5 conferences. Let's not forget that about Brian Kelly's 12-0 and Luke Fickell's 12-0. Okay, Luke Fickell's 12-0 included 2 Power 5 wins, Notre Dame and Indiana, right? Brian Kelly had to beat Pitt. He had to beat Louisville. He had to beat Syracuse. He had to beat like teams that are now Power 5 teams, right? He was in the Big East, not the American Athletic Conference, where he was beating Tulsa and Memphis and Navy and South Florida and Houston, right? We get that, okay? You people understand that, right? Like it was most of the teams he beat, the exception like UConn, are teams that are now Power 5, that are now in the ACC or the Big Ten conferences like that, right? Big difference, number one. Number two, who was the person doing the majority of the recruiting during during Luke Fickell's tenure at Cincinnati? Who's the guy that recruited all the players on their current roster?
That's the point that I made to you yesterday. That's my biggest concern with Luke Fickell is, can he recruit? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it is. But right now, the dynamic side of the ball is the defense, and every one of those kids was recruited by Marcus Freeman. So, I mean, that's just a fact. And so, maybe Luke Fickell is a dynamic recruiter. I don't know, though. I don't know, because Marcus Freeman was there recruiting the defensive side of the ball. And I don't know that I'm willing to sit around and wait to see if that's the case. You know what I mean? Like the risk of hiring Marcus Freeman, allowing him to bring in top recruiting classes, and maybe he's only a 9-10 win a year coach, and eventually you get rid of him after 3 or 4 years, that is a smaller risk, because you'll still have the coffers filled with good recruits, okay, than not bringing him in as head coach, and he goes off someplace else and does it there and is successful and wins a national championship or whatever the case may be. If we're looking at risk reward, and that's what people in business do all the time, return on investment, right? And that Jack Swarbrick's a business guy. The risk is so much smaller bringing in Marcus Freeman right now, because if you don't, your 22 class gets screwed up, your 23 class gets screwed up, the entire staff is probably gone. I mean, you are putting Notre Dame steps back, not steps forward, or even where they are right now, right? And those are just facts. Those are just facts. You're muted, by the way.
I think the other thing with recruiting is there's this notion that you can't get kids here because you can't pay kids. Anyone that says that doesn't know recruiting. Are there kids that want money? Yeah. Are there kids that will take money because they feel their family needs it? Yes. Is that the majority of kids? No. Anyone that knows recruiting knows. And look, all these schools, they don't buy every kid. Bama doesn't buy every kid. Smart coaches that cheat buy the kids they need to buy. You're not going to buy. And that was the thing, is like SMU. That's what got SMU in trouble, is they were offering money to kids that never asked for it. They were giving things to it's like the movie Blue Chips, right? Like, they're giving money to people that didn't ask for it. That's when you're being stupid with it. And that's the people get caught. You're just handing out bags of McDonald's, bags of cash, right?
Right.
Schools like Clemson and Alabama, they're smart about it. They buy the kids they need to buy, and they were just recruit the kids that don't have their hand out. There are plenty of kids and plenty of families that don't have their hand out because they know that's not the message I want to send to my kid.
Absolutely. And look, they're getting a free education.
And that's also not relevant anymore, because with NIL, Notre Dame can compete with that now.
Yeah, good point.
So that doesn't really matter a whole lot. We're going to get to super chats at the end, but I did have one I wanted to get to here real quick, because I just want to dispel this right now. Lucas Chapman says, I 100% want Freeman as head coach, but Fickell can work out too. If Freeman does stay DC under Fickell, that will be a star staff. We would probably lose Reese in exchange for Denbrock. Thoughts? I've said this before, I'm going to be emphatic about it now. There is no way Marcus Freeman is going to coach under Luke Fickell again.
No.
Not going to happen. And it's because of Luke Fickell, not Marcus Freeman. Okay? Now, that's about all I can get into right now, but that's a fact. There's no way Marcus Freeman stays at Notre Dame unless he's the head coach. It's not going to work for Luke Fickell. Okay? It's not going to happen. So you either hire Marcus Freeman or you say goodbye to Marcus Freeman.
Right.
It's that simple.
Yep.
There's no so-and-so with Marcus Freeman, okay? It's either you want Luke Fickell or you don't, and you don't want Marcus Freeman, or you want Marcus Freeman.
Because look, Marcus Freeman has other opportunities, right?
A lot.
I mean, he can go be the highest paid defensive coordinator at LSU. That offer's on the table.
Yeah.
He's going to potentially interview with Duke, be a head coach.
And here's the other deal. Clemson, there's a lot of rumblings going on that Oklahoma's going to hire Brent Venables as their new head coach. Clemson's going to throw a lot of money at Marcus Freeman to be the next defensive coordinator.
Exactly.
And you can kiss goodbye. You can say goodbye to Jalen Sneed when Marcus Freeman leaves Notre Dame. You can say goodbye to him. You can say goodbye to the DB class. I was told and I put this on the message board last night, that about half the class is gone if Marcus Freeman leaves.
Drake Bowen leaves too from the 23 class.
Well, they'll lose him, Keon Keeley, and Brennan Vernon for sure. Gone.
Yep.
Those guys are gone. If Marcus Freeman's not coming back, neither is Mike Elston. I got some updates on the message board you're going to want to check out. But if we get into the weekend and Marcus Freeman's not the head coach, the staff's going to be gone.
Yep.
Because they can't wait around forever.
And that's just
common
sense.
It tells me that Jack Swarbrick is pushing for
somebody
Luke
else.
Fickell.
Yeah.
And so we'll get into more of that. But I just wanted to point that out real quick too, because there's this Freeman Fickle debate going on in the chat. So I want to address that. I think here's my second big issue with Brian Kelly that I look at and say, I don't believe are entirely his fault, but are mostly his fault. And that's coaching hires and mistakes with coaching hires. I think the fact is Notre Dame does not work with the same budget when it comes to paying coaches as a place like Ohio State and Alabama and LSU. It's just a fact.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Having said that, that doesn't mean you can't get really good coaches. It just means you need to work a little harder to do it. But that's not really the issue because Brian Kelly's hired a lot of good coaches at Notre Dame, and the reality is a lot of them have stayed. Here's an example. Marcus Freeman, if Brian Kelly was still the head coach of Notre Dame, these same schools offering him a bunch of money would still be offering him it, and I don't think he would leave because he loves what Notre Dame is about. He's not going to stay now because for different reasons, but he's going to make a ton of money. Money's not the reason Marcus Freeman's not going to stay as the defensive coordinator of Notre Dame.
No.
Okay, so they're able to go out and get a Harry Hiestand and get a Lance Taylor and get a Marcus Freeman and get a Mike Mickens and Mike Elston and those kind of guys. They've gotten plenty of those guys. The problem has been he's made too many mistakes. Not too many. He's made a few mistakes at very, very important positions, and it's his unwillingness to fix those mistakes that has hurt him as well, in my opinion. And one being Brian Van Gorder. I mean, we can't prove this, but we can debate it. If you look at the talent that Notre Dame had in 2015, that team had more first, second, and third round draft picks than Clemson did, who won a title in 2016 and lost the title game in 2015. Beat Notre Dame by 2 points at the end of the game. So when you look at that, you say, well, what if he would have hired a Mike Elko type instead of Brian Van Gorder? Or, more importantly, what if he would have had the foresight that people like Urban Meyer and Nick Saban have shown, where you make a mistake and immediately this was a mistake and you rectify it? We knew at the end of the 2014 season when Notre Dame gave up almost 30 points a game that this wasn't the guy. And they were giving up points before all the injuries set in. They gave up a bunch of points to Navy. They gave up a bunch of points to North Carolina. Completely got out-coached in the second half by Jimbo Fisher. Brian Van Gorder did. We knew then, but Brian Kelly was unwilling to admit it until it was too late, right? We saw the same with the offensive line. What we saw this year is what Vince and I feared during the summer, and it's what we've been talking about since 2018 and 2019, is the Jeff Quinn hire was when your O-line, you have to make sure you have someone good enough to continue that tradition.
Yep.
The fact is Jeff Quinn's a nice, solid coach,
yeah,
but he's not a dominant coach, and you need a dominant coach in the offensive line, and they didn't do that. Allowing Autry Denson to be here for 3 years and recruit the way that he did. The fact that you didn't realize that you were losing Ronald Darby because your coaches weren't putting in the work until it was too late. Those are the kind of things that the inability of Brian Kelly to stay locked in and hold his staff accountable has been a big coaching mistake. That's not a Notre Dame problem. That was a Brian Kelly problem. Now, can you go out there and just outbid people for the highest assistant coaches? Nope.
No,
can't do it.
You can't.
And so sometimes that's why you name a Tommy Rees as your offensive coordinator instead of Joe Moorhead. And the concern that some had is, Joe Moorhead comes and he leaves in 2 years. Well, it looks like that's what he's going to do. My contention was you hire him for 2 years, let Tommy groom under him, and then now Tommy steps in. But the flip side of that is Tommy now has 2 years of experience under his belt. It wasn't so much hiring Tommy. I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I wasn't railing against it, right?
Sure.
Tommy's got a lot of potential. It was always about he's got a lot of potential. Well, he's now getting into that potential being fulfilled moment.
He's starting to click right now.
Right.
And this is when I would have hired him.
As a recruiter and as a coach. Now, here's the problem.
Yeah.
You saddled this 28-year-old young, smart guy with two coaches that just flat aren't good enough at this level. That's not a Tommy Rees problem. That's a Brian Kelly problem. And I'm sorry, you can't tell me you can't find that he hired Jeff Quinn because that's the only guy the school could afford to get. That's false. That's chose him.
Nonsense.
And so same with Del Alexander, that Del Alexander to continue the same mediocre coaching and mediocre recruiting for 5 years is a Brian Kelly problem, not a Notre Dame problem. And so that's number two of the excuses that we see that are not Notre Dame problems. They are Brian Kelly problems. There's a lot of good coaches out there. Not some of them coach at Alabama, some of them coach at Baylor. Some of them coach at Utah State. Some of them coach, you know what I mean? Find them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And develop. I mean, Lou Holtz brought this young, energetic, smart coach from Colorado State, right? Who before that was at Cincinnati, Indiana State, places like that, right? Brought him as an assistant coach. Guy was a great recruiter, great position coach, went on to become a head coach, won 3 national championships. Yes, I'm talking about Urban Meyer. Got him from Colorado State, right? I mean, Barry Alvarez came from Iowa. You don't have to go take guys from Alabama staff to find great coaches.
And you can, to have a good mix of guys with experience, guys that are young and hungry, like that's the mix that you want to see on a staff anyway, right? Take a chance on a guy. But the key is knowing when it's time to cut bait. And I think that's where I had the biggest issue with Brian. Because look, you're going to hire guys that don't work out. Like that's going to happen. It happens to everybody. And you've said that a million times when we've talked about, Brian Van Gorder and, it happens. You're going to make bad hires. It's somebody that's just not a fit and it just doesn't work. Well, you've got to be willing to cut them off. Friendships be damned. Like you've got to be able to be like, look, man, it's just not working. I will write you a glowing letter of recommendation. I will help you get a head coaching job at a D2 school. I will do whatever I need to do to help you out. But you know what, man? It's just not working here. And when you're the head coach at Notre Dame, you have to be able to have those kinds of conversations with people.
Right. And there has to be a level of accountability that you set.
Exactly.
And that's the big key.
And that's my issue with it. Like, look, Notre Dame holds you back a little bit with the pay. I get that. I totally get that. And is it ridiculous to a degree? Yeah, it is, because we know Notre Dame has a boatload of cash. Okay. So yes, I agree that it's ridiculous, but you can definitely work under those restraints. Okay. You were clearly the highest bidder for Marcus Freeman for your defensive coordinator between him and LSU. Right. So clearly there's money to be spent and there's things that you can do. And there's coaches that will work at Notre Dame for a little bit less money because it's Notre Dame. That still exists, okay? But you have to find the right people, and that might take a little bit extra, So that's where I come down on it. Yes, there are some things impeding, but Notre Dame when it comes to coaches, but there are also things that held Brian Kelly back as well, or that, you know what I mean?
Right. So the final piece of this is I was going to say I wanted to talk about offense, but I think it's a bigger picture than that. It's I don't know. Like, I believe Brian Kelly was not engaged enough in college football, meaning like I remember when I was coaching, I know some people hate this, but whatever. It's my show. I can do whatever I want. I remember when I was coaching, we had a year where we had Bowling Green, Virginia, and our staff were all came to our campus, and we just sat there and just talked ball all day. It was like Al Groh, Anthony Poindexter, Mike Groh. I mean, we had a lot of those guys. Tim Beckman, who was the head coach at Bowling Green at this time, his staff was there, and we just talked ball. What are you guys doing about this? Well, what about when you face this, and what about when you do that? And that's something the coaches do all the time.
Yep.
I've been told by many people that's not really where Brian Kelly is anymore. And so when you're that way, you're still living in this mindset of trying to chase 2012 Bama. Well, Bama's not even chasing 2012 Bama anymore. And you're always behind. One of the things that I like about Marcus Freeman, and it's part of the excitement I have about Tommy Rees, kind of when he's away from Brian Kelly, is I know Tommy Rees studies Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan. Now, I have a bit of an issue that those are the only guys he studies, or those are the primary guys he studies. I'd like to see him study Jeff Brom and Phil Longo and more college coaches, but he's trying to stay on top of trends and innovative things.
That's huge.
That's not really Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly still, this is who we are, and we're going to do this. And so what that has done is that keeps you from being ahead of the game. So Nick Saban, for example, 2010 and 2011 completely changed. Like 2010 and 2012, completely changed Nick Saban's shift at Alabama. And he'd already won 3 titles by then, right? He won one in 9, he won one in 11 and 12, correct? But when he faced Cam Newton, it's like, okay, this kid's a little bit different. But then when he went and faced Johnny Manziel, and you started to see more and more of this, it was like, okay, this is the future. And eventually starts making that shift to where he has to be able to defend that,
Yep.
And he started saying, well, I want that. And it wasn't so much the Johnny Manziel type of quarterback. It was the dynamic quarterback, but also the fact that college football is moving towards a more explosive offenses where you can't beat team 17-14 anymore. You got to outscore them. And he's adapted to that. Everyone else has adapted to that. Notre Dame has been very, very slow to adapt to that. I don't think you can say it's a talent problem. That's what, like, I was in one of the shows last night, and the LSU people were like, well, Notre Dame's, they've always had average receivers. And I'm like, that's just something somebody that knows nothing about Notre Dame would say. You know, like, I'll take Notre Dame's fastest receiver in the last 10 years and put him up against LSU's fastest receiver in the last 10 years. Right? I mean, you got anybody running faster than 4.32? Because that's what Will Fuller ran.
Right.
You know what I mean? Now, you look at Justin Jefferson, great player. Ran the same 40 time at his pro day that Miles Boykin and Chase Claypool ran. Right? I mean, Notre Dame's had the speed. Speed's not a problem for Notre Dame. It's, are you running a system that allows them to play to that potential? And up until the last 6 games, we saw a bit of it in 2016, 2019. We saw it in 2018 when Ian Book first took over. That offense was good.
Yeah.
That offense was really good. And then, of course, Ian Book just kind of, he was never the same player after he broke his ribs. He was really never the same guy. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. It could just be that's when teams started getting enough film on him that they could then play him.
Yeah.
But, that 2019, they did some really fun, exciting things with Braden Lindsey and Chase Claypool down the stretch. But to me, it's I don't know if it's so much that his stubbornness with offense or just his lack of innovation and keeping up and being ahead of the time.
And that's the key. And being willing to change.
Right.
Look, Brian Kelly was willing to change after 2012 when he got his brains pounded in the national championship game, but he was late to the game to change, and then he stayed on that course too long. That's the problem. Is that, okay, you can say that Kelly's willing to change, but most of the time it's been because he's been forced to change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the key right there. And the more and more I sit and think about it, and the more and more we hear about how things were going this year and the fact that LSU and Brian Kelly were in contact and all these different things, right? The more and more I think about it, the second half of the season where we saw, the offense take off and allowing Tommy Rees to have more control and things like that, it just makes me feel like Brian Kelly checked out a little bit.
We're hearing more and more about that.
This is my speculation. I'm hearing more and more about that he kind of started pushing for an extension like in the middle of the season, and he was using the whole, look what we're doing with this young, inexperienced team, and Notre Dame rebuffed it. Yeah.
And then when he started seeing Mel Tucker and these people get that money and Notre Dame wasn't willing to work with him, he was like, I'm leaving. Right. Which is why Sean said in the show, was it Monday night that he was hearing that, Brian Kelly, people already knew around Notre Dame knew before the Stanford game that he wanted out. So to your point, Vince, yeah, I don't think it's speculation to a degree,
right?
But it's speculation
just because I wasn't in the room,
right? It's speculation that's based on evidence, things we're seeing, logically putting things together, stuff like that.
Exactly.
So continue your point. I just wanted to back you up.
Yeah, no. So I feel like he kind of checked out, and Tommy Rees is like, "Sweet, I got control, so I'm going to do my thing." And I think that's when the offense started to take off. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a coincidence. I really don't. Like, we were lauding Brian Kelly for either allowing Tommy Rees to do it or noticing that it wasn't working the way they were trying to do it, and so they re-looked at everything and they did. I don't think that was the case. Yeah. I really don't. Right. So
I don't think more of the story, Vince, Notre Dame's lack of offensive explosiveness is not a personnel problem. Right. That could be dependent upon Notre Dame's limitations from a recruiting standpoint. I don't think anyone can tell me that Notre Dame can't recruit the same players that North Carolina recruited. Right? That you can't. And look what they've done.
Right.
Notre Dame chose not to go after Sam Howell. It's a fact. Okay, he camped it. He did Irish Invasion here. Same year as JT Daniels and Avery Davis. They just went a different direction. So they wanted Cade McNamara instead. Is what it is, right? So that to me, and then the final one, Vince, and this one is going to be short and sweet, and then we're going to quickly work through some super chats here. But it's the business-like approach that he took. That's
Yeah.
a Notre Dame thing. That's a Brian Kelly thing. The fact that his team, even this year against Cincinnati, just constantly showed up with a lack of emotion in big games is a Brian Kelly thing, not a Notre Dame thing. Because that was never a problem under Lou Holtz. Never a problem under Lou Holtz. And honestly, it really wasn't a problem in Charlie's first couple of years. I don't think.
No, I agree.
So that's a Brian Kelly thing. That's not a Notre Dame thing. And that's the final piece for me. All those things are the things that really keep Notre Dame from taking that next step.
Sure.
And they're all, to me, either a coaching problem or, yes, it's more challenging here and it's unique here, but you can still be successful. You just have to be dynamic.
Right.
I think at the end of the day, it's where it is, because I think Notre Dame needs a head coach that is dynamic. Lou Holtz was dynamic.
Right.
Bob Davie was not. Ty was not. Charlie Weiss was to a degree, which is why he recruited so well. He just wasn't a coach.
He was a dynamic recruiter, but he tried to run things like an NFL team.
Right.
That doesn't work in college.
Right.
You
and
know,
Brian Kelly is not dynamic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
He's just not a dynamic personality.
Sorry.
Smart, successful,
yes.
did a lot of great things, but he's not dynamic. And to win it, you can't just have anybody. You need a dynamic coach.
And he's a hands-off CEO guy. That's who he is.
And that's what makes the coaching mistakes even more important.
Right.
So Vince, let's work through some super chats here, as many as we can here before you have to leave, and then so you back at the top. Isn't it so wonderful that we can scroll through the top again? I want to stop talking about it because I feel like we're going to jinx it, and it's going to.
All right, I think James has the first one. Does that look right? Are you up there, or do you wanted me to go up?
I'm going up there too. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. James with the super chat. Thanks, James. Hashtag Freeman era on Twitter. It's everywhere.
I'm going to tell you right now, if Jack, it's to the point now where no matter what Jack Swarbrick thinks he should do, he has to hire Marcus Freeman. He's going to completely lose his. You can't say this team. True. This is what he said at his press conference. This success has been about the players and the culture that they created. You can't say that and then say, but I'm going to completely ignore their wishes and not hire the guy that they want.
Yeah.
It's
the players, it's the alumni, it is the ex-players, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear. It's a pretty loud singular voice. So
right.
Hey Bob has the next one. Thanks. Hey Bob. Are there limitations at Notre Dame? Yes. Is Brian Kelly exaggerating those limitations and using them as an excuse for why he couldn't take Notre Dame to the next level? Also, yes.
Nailed
there
it.
You go. In a nutshell.
Nailed it.
In a nutshell, that's exactly correct.
Yep.
Alex,
say Vince, I'm gonna go through and find these. You read them.
Okay, sounds good.
That?
Alex, thanks for the super chat. Brian, was Marcus? The initials thing is going to get me every time. I just want to let everybody know that when it says MF. So, was Marcus Freeman's initial hire BK or Swarbrick?
Both. Look, Brian Kelly put work in to get Marcus Freeman. I'm not, because he's gone now and I don't like him or whatever the case may be. I'm not going to then not give him credit where credit is due. That was on Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly. Now, did he go to Jack Swarbrick and say, "Hey, we need to do this and do that"? And was Jack Swarbrick on board with it? Absolutely. And the head coach can't make the kind of moves Brian Kelly made without the AD approving more money.
Right.
But it was Brian Kelly that put the work to get Marcus Freeman here. And from everything I've been told. Okay, so he deserves credit for that. Absolutely deserves credit for that.
Jason, thanks for the super chat. Does retaining Bayless and trying to retain Reese mean it's Freeman? I would think Fickle or Campbell would want their own guy. Look, I agree with this statement 100%, but I don't know. I mean, we don't know. Yes, it leads to that. I think the logic leads to that. Because if I'm either one of those guys, I'm going to Notre Dame, I want my own staff. And I think that's a non-negotiable.
Strength coaches, it can be with certain coaches, but a lot of coaches are like, Matt Bayless is considered he's a very well-known strength coach. If you really want to be here, you're going to be fine working Matt Bayless. And if you want to be dead set on your own guy, then you're not going to be here. And I've heard that Matt Bayless or that Luke Fickell wants to bring his own strength coach. So maybe that's a deal breaker. The problem that I have is that Luke Fickell or that Jack Swarbrick's going to continue to drag his feet, and eventually say, well, I can't get Luke Fickell, but Marcus Freeman's going to be gone by then.
Exactly.
And then you're going to have to settle for a Matt Campbell. That's the problem with all this whole thing. So it does not mean it, though. You're going to see a lot of times at schools is, hey, here's our strength coach. And if you don't want to work with them, then go find somewhere else to work. And I think that's
the Reese thing is a little bit more telling in my opinion. But again, nothing's set in stone.
But see,
yet.
what's going to happen is he's negotiating these things as he's trying to find a new coach,
right?
And he's going to end up saying, "Well, if you're Luke Fickell, you're like, well, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to hire my own staff." And then he's going to turn him down. This is my biggest fear. He drags his feet. Luke Fickell eventually says no. Especially as the more and more Ryan Day to the NFL rumors start coming up, you're going to see even Luke Fickell even be more willing to say no to Notre Dame. And then you're screwed because you lost Marcus Freeman. Luke Fickell said no, and then you've got to go to Plan B. And that's my biggest fear of this whole thing. It's my biggest fear.
Yeah. Corey D, thanks for the super chat. I'm reading that right now. Luke Fickell is the leading candidate. I maintain Marcus Freeman should be hired. Corey, I'm guessing you're reading a national person. I'm just going to say that.
Well, right? I'm hearing more and more, Vince, that's what Swarbrick, that is Swarbrick's first choice. Doesn't mean he's not willing to go to Freeman if he doesn't think he can get Fickell, or if he isn't willing to wait for the entire playoff for Fickell to get in. I think right now I'm honestly praying that Cincinnati wins this weekend. Because my fear is that Jack's going to try to take it into the weekend, and if Cincinnati loses, they're not in the playoff, Fickell will leave. Right? But if they're in the playoff, Fickell's not. He's going to say, you got to wait till the playoff is over to even announce. By that point in time, you've missed signing day.
Yeah,
you're going to sign like Nolan Ziegler, and that is it, right? I mean, like, so that to me is a worse. So it's almost like, it may hurt Notre Dame's playoff chances, but it's going to help them get the right coach, right? So that's my big concern, to be honest with you. And as of last night, there's a big push in Notre Dame of decision makers that want Freeman. There's one person that, as of 2 hours ago, the last time I talked to a source, there's one person at Notre Dame that really wants Fickell, and that's Jack Swarbrick. I've heard Father Jenkins wants Freeman. I've heard a lot of the board wants Freeman. I've heard there's a lot of people that want Freeman. But the ultimate decision maker is Jack Swarbrick, and he really is enamored with the idea of
this Father Jenkins not Trump Swarbrick.
No.
Okay, that was a legit question.
He doesn't do that. No, okay. No. If Jack wants that, that's what Jack's going to get.
Okay, fair enough. Hey, I got to roll. The bell's going to ring here soon. So everybody, I will see you guys tomorrow, maybe sooner. Hey, that'd be great. Because that means there was an announcement.
We don't know that. Vince is just saying.
No, I said if. If there's an announcement, I'll see you sooner.
Yeah, but, we don't know that there is.
No, I don't know anything. Bye.
Let's finish up these super chats. We got one from Jay Clampett Investments. Brian, does this concern come from intel or is it speculation? Please tell me Jack doesn't screw it up. It's a little bit of both, to be completely honest with you. I am hearing some things that Jack really likes Luke Fickell, but I also know that Jack likes Marcus Freeman. It's just about whether or not he's willing to take a chance on a guy that's never been a head coach before. And I think that's really where it comes from. I think there's a lot of people on campus that like Marcus Freeman. I've been told that Marcus Freeman and Jack Swarbrick are meeting. Either they're already meeting or they're meeting in a little bit, but they're going to meet today. They have met before. This is their second meeting. I put this intel on Irish Breakdown message board last night, letting people know that this was happening, and it's just depending on how that goes. So I put a post out on the message board today, and basically the point was the next 24 to 48 hours are going to tell us a lot. If we go into the weekend and he has not named a head coach either publicly or privately, again, he doesn't have to necessarily do it publicly, but if we go into this weekend and he hasn't named a head coach, it tells me he's waiting to see what happens with Cincinnati, and that means he wants Fickell. If that happens, you're going to lose Elston, you're going to lose Freeman, you're going to lose Reese, because they can't wait around forever for you to decide that you want Marcus Freeman. Brian Kelly's not going to wait around forever for Mike Elston and Tommy Reese and Marcus Freeman to make their decisions. Other schools that are offering these coaches jobs are not going to wait around forever to see if they're willing to come to their place. They're just going to move on. And so they have to look out for themselves if Jack Swarbrick's going to drag his feet and not make a quick decision. He says, there's no time frame. Yeah, there is a time frame. There has to be a time frame. Otherwise, you're going to completely lose the staff that you praised. You're going to completely lose a lot of the recruiting class. And any player that's thinking about leaving Notre Dame after the season, Foskey, Kyron, they're all going to leave. That's just what I'm being told. And so it's a concern. It's definitely a concern of mine Absolutely. J. Beth Martin, I know it's not the focus of this conversation, but please tell me the decision will be soon. This is affecting my work. I keep checking my phone. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that there will be a decision soon. There could be, depending on how the meeting today goes with Marcus Freeman. If Marcus just blows Jack away, then Jack may say, you know what, this is where we want to go. If he doesn't, then he may continue doing his doing. He's reached out to a lot of coaches around the country to gauge interest. He is legitimately reaching out to people, legitimately, not just doing it for show. He's legitimately reaching out to people. Part of that is because he hasn't had a formal interview with Marcus yet. That's going to happen. It's either already happening or it's going to happen here very soon. And I think how that goes is going to tell us a lot. If we come out of that in the next 24 to 48 hours and he hasn't made a decision, then it's leaning towards him not naming a coach or not naming Marcus Freeman as the coach, which means, yeah, that would be bad. That would be really bad. Whatever you think of Marcus Freeman, the reality is he's who the players want. He's who the majority of the fan base wants, and he's who a lot of people at Notre Dame want, and a lot of former players. Now, the fan base doesn't matter. My opinion doesn't matter, but the players' opinions should. And when it's this overwhelming and you don't listen to that, it's going to be a problem. Justin Olson with us. Thank you for the super chat, Justin. Great job on the LSU shows. Thank you. They were shocked to hear an Indy person who knew football. You blew them away. Funny how they responded when you said we had NFL talent. The fan commenters were baffled. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like Notre Dame had the third most players drafted in the NFL last year, and yet all these SEC schools. You know, one SEC school that doesn't disrespect Notre Dame's talent, mostly Georgia fans. Why? Because they've seen it up close and personal. That it's good. But you'd think LSU fans would know, right? You've lost twice to Notre Dame, but whatever. I get it is what it is. Patrick Fitzgerald, now that BK has the best resources, I'm sure nothing will hold him back. I'm loving the sarcasm that is oozing out of that comment, Patrick. That is wonderful. Really appreciate it. The Spanky 412 with a super chat. Thank you. That SOB got a lot of balls for what he said to those LSU players. Let me tell you, I didn't listen to the press conference. I just chose not to. I didn't like listening to Brian Kelly talk when he was the head coach at Notre Dame. I'm not going to listen to him talk when he's the head coach at another place. So it wouldn't shock me. Brian Kelly made a living blaming everybody else for his failures. Not failures, shortcomings. It doesn't surprise me that he's doing the same thing now that he's at LSU. So it shouldn't surprise anybody else. Matthew Edwards of the super chat. Thank you for that, Matthew. I share Brian's concern regarding the potential for Jack's risk aversion in favor of the status quo. His own risk-reward calculus may have him more incentivized to minimize downside than to maximize upside. It's a great point because the minimizing downside means you want the safer pick. That's Luke Fickell. That's Matt Campbell. The maximizing the upside is Marcus Freeman. And we don't know whether or not he's willing to take that risk. Look, I said this the other day in an article yesterday. You have to be bold. You have to be bold. And, you know, I just don't know if Jack Swarbrick at this stage in his career is willing to do that. I hope that he is. I hope I'm wrong. I've been wrong about him before, and I hope I'm wrong now. And we'll find out. We will find out. Rouse Productions, the fact that they are trying to retain Reese makes it feel like Freeman hired to me. Why would they push to retain if hiring outside head coach thoughts? There's a lot to this whole thing. I do think that if Tommy Reese accepts the job, accepts the OC position, that it would lead towards that. I don't think that they haven't really worked out a deal as far as I know. I know he met with Jack last night. As far as I know, there was no deal that was worked out with Tommy Reese. And so if Tommy stays and if they offer Tommy the job to stay and he accepts it, it would be the first real big domino that would lead me to believe that they're going to retain Marcus as the head coach. Unless he's talked to Luke Fickell and or Matt Campbell or whoever, and they've expressed interest in Tommy Reese as well, because that could also be part of it. So when I look at this, these little things may lead to that, but they don't necessarily. And definitely the Matt Bayless thing definitely does not mean that anything about Marcus Freeman. That has nothing to do with Marcus Freeman at all. Tommy Reese could, because my understanding is that Marcus and Tommy are sort of a package deal, right? Meaning if Marcus stays, he wants Tommy to stay. If Tommy feels that Notre Dame is going to keep Marcus, he's going to be more willing to stay. Does that make sense? And at least that's kind of my intel. I've actually heard that now from two different people. So we're going to see how this thing plays out. Super chat from AJ. I really just feel like Notre Dame is going to pull a Notre Dame and not hire the guy every player, recruit, et cetera, is pulling for and go with Fickle. Yeah, we've been here before. We've been here before. It's kind of like my gut. That just you kind of assume the worst, and yeah, that's kind of my. And it's a shame because Luke Fickle's a good football coach. I just don't think I think he's just going to be Brian Kelly 2.0. That's the problem. Michael Brahoni, the further this drags on, the more I get worried Jack Swarbrick is waiting for his guy and not Freeman. Have a bad feeling Jack Swarbrick screws this up. I can't disagree with you. I can't disagree with you. Okay, let's get down here. We got a few more of these super chats. Dro the Gooner. Freeman will be able to recruit the athletes from upper middle class black families that will value an education from Notre Dame. When A&M hired Sumlin, they got a huge boost in recruiting. And that is a good point. I don't focus a whole lot on that because I can't really speak to that, but that I think there's merit to that. I do. I think that I don't want to dive into it too much. Maybe that'll be something that we can bring Sean on more because he is from Chicago. He is from an area where that's going to be more prevalent to have experience. But I think there's some merit to that, Dro, because I think that you've got someone that, and it's not, to me, it's not just because he's black. It's because of the type of person he is. The fact that most of these kids, especially kids, that are recruited at a high level because they meet so many different coaches, they can kind of get a sense for who's BSing them and who's being straight. Marcus Freeman comes across as very genuine. And I think a lot of people, especially in the South, because I spent a lot of time in the South living and coaching. You call Virginia and the Carolinas the South. And I did live in Florida for a while. And I think even there, that genuineness is desired even more. At least that was my experience. And so, and there's a lot of kids like that. There's a lot of kids like that. There's more kids like that than people realize, which is why I get so frustrated with this notion that Notre Dame just can't recruit enough players because of academics. I think if you get the right coach, you can. And Lou Holtz did. And, look how that turned out. So appreciate the super chat, Dro. David DuPont, I agree with you. These 24 to 48 hours are critical. David is responding also to a post that I believe that I made on the message board where I said, we're going to know what's going on in the next 24 to 48 hours. We're either going to have Marcus Freeman as the head coach and this staff stays together mostly intact, or we're going to not have any announcement whatsoever and the staff's going to be gone. That's how I see this playing out. Savage Science Fitness reading right now from an hour ago on UHND. Jack is meeting with Freeman today. Right. I mentioned this on the message board last night. That's why you should be on the message board, because we did talk about that. And of course we talked about that early in the show. And it's this, and what I mentioned last night too on the board is this is the second meeting that he's having with Jack. The first one was more of a, okay, let's gauge some interest. Let's talk about these next couple days, because Marcus talked to the team after Brian Kelly did yesterday. And it was by design, and won't get too much into what was said because I don't have a lot of specifics. I will hopefully eventually be able to get into it. I'm not holding it back. I want to make sure that I have good intel before I say anything. But today's meeting is the more formal interview, but it's not the first meeting that him and Jack have had since Kelly left. J. Feth Martin, agree with you, Vince. Stop with the MF. It's bad. Yes. I get it. It's messing Vince up. It's all in his head. So you guys being mean to Vince with your super chats. Steve Williams, the lifelong Notre Dame fan. I do not want Fickle. Freeman has the it factor that will launch Notre Dame where we need to go. Yes, I'm going to have an article coming out later today saying that Notre Dame needs a dynamic coach. And it's going to be making a case for Freeman and also what my concerns are with Luke Fickle. Because I think Luke Fickle's a very good football coach. I just don't think he's I don't think he is a dynamic coach. And that's the problem. All right, Terrence and Ashley Bergen. Okay, heading to sign up for the message board now. I love it. I love it. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. I've seen several people sign up during the show. So, yeah, so I can't. Now, listen, I do want to say this, and I had somebody respond to me. We had such an overwhelming people getting to the board that it's kind of slowed our board down. We are definitely working on that. I have given my tech people, which is my wife's tech team and her employees are working on it. We are trying to get that fixed. We hope to have that fixed by the end of the day. So I'm aware of the slowness of the boards. We will get it fixed. I wasn't anticipating Brian Kelly leaving. This was a task that we were working on to get fixed by signing day, and so with Brian Kelly leaving, it kind of messed things up a little bit. So just be prepared for that, but know that it's a temporary thing that just kind of happened when Brian Kelly left because our board got overwhelmed with people coming to it. We have gained about 75 to 100 customers in the last 48 hours, and that doesn't count the people that we've had signed up today. So it is being addressed. It is being fixed. We hope to have it in the next, by the end of the night, but we shall see. And then Hunter with the super chat. I think the Bayless re-sign is more telling than anything. Fickle is going nowhere without Brady Collins. He is Fickle's right-hand man 110%. I've heard that, Hunter, and I don't know how true that is, but I have heard that before, that's going to be a deal breaker for him. His strength coach is a deal breaker. And I hope that that's true. And I hope that Luke Fickle tells Jack Freeman that, or Jack Swarbrick that, and he realizes, there we go. So that's going to be it. That's going to be it for today's show, everybody. So I appreciate all of you very, very much. We will have another show tomorrow at 12:30. We'll figure out what the topic is. We're kind of back and forth on a couple things, but everything is kind of been a little jacked up because of all this stuff, but we love it. It's been a lot of fun to talk about. So I want to thank everybody for joining the show today. We'll be back again here in a little less than 24 hours. And if there is news that breaks, and I don't know of any news that's going to break, we will certainly do a show on it. So that's why you need to hit the like button, subscribe button, but more importantly, the notification bell, because that's going to let you know when we have shows ready to go. So thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your day.